The sun rose over the plains of Cannae on August 2, 216 BC, illuminating the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 86,000 men stood in formation, stretching across the landscape in a mass of shields, spears, and discipline. Two consuls commanded them, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, political rivals forced to share command on alternating days. Today was Varro's day. He looked across the field at the Carthaginian army, maybe 50,000 strong, and saw victory. The Romans outnumbered Hannibal's forces. They had better armor, more infantry, and the weight of Rome's military tradition behind them. This was the day Rome would crush the African invader who had terrorized Italy for 2 years. By sunset, 50,000 Romans would be dead, the consular army annihilated, and Hannibal Barca would have executed the most perfect tactical victory in military history. This is the story of how one man destroyed the greatest army of the ancient world in a single afternoon. Hannibal had been in Italy since 218 BC, leading a Carthaginian army over the Alps in one of history's most audacious invasions. He brought war elephants, Numidian cavalry, Spanish infantry, and African veterans across mountains that Romans thought impassable. He arrived in northern Italy with maybe 26,000 men and immediately began dismantling Roman power. He won at the Trebia River, destroying a consular army in an ambush. He won at Lake Trasimene, annihilating another Roman force in a massive ambush that killed 15,000 in 3 hours. Rome was reeling, terrified that Hannibal would march on the city itself. But Hannibal didn't march on Rome. He knew he couldn't besiege the city without siege equipment and reinforcements. Instead, he marched through Italy, raiding, burning, trying to break Rome's alliance system by demonstrating that Rome couldn't protect its allies. The strategy was working. Italian cities were defecting, joining Hannibal, believing Rome was finished. Rome needed a decisive victory to reverse the momentum. The Senate authorized the largest army ever fielded, 2 full consular armies combined into one massive force. They would find Hannibal, engage him in open battle where Roman numbers and discipline would crush him and end this war. The plan was simple, straightforward, and exactly what Hannibal wanted. The Roman army that marched toward Cannae was built on the legion system, one of history's most effective military organizations. Legions fought in maniples, small units that could maneuver independently, creating flexibility while maintaining cohesion. Roman soldiers wore armor, carried large shields, threw javelins to disrupt enemy formations, and then closed for brutal hand-to-hand combat with short swords designed for stabbing. They trained constantly, drilled until movements were automatic, and fought with a discipline that terrified enemies. The Roman military machine had conquered Italy through relentless pressure, tactical adaptability, and willingness to absorb casualties that would break other states. Rome lost battles but never lost wars. They rebuild, raise new armies, and come back until the enemy was crushed. This resilience made Rome terrifying. You could defeat Roman armies, but defeating Rome itself required destroying their will to fight. Hannibal understood this. He couldn't just win battles. He had to break Rome psychologically, make them believe continued resistance was futile. Cannae would be his masterpiece. Hannibal's army was multinational, a coalition of Carthaginian veterans, Spanish swordsmen, Gallic warriors, and Numidian cavalry. They fought for pay, plunder, and Hannibal's reputation. He'd led them for years, never losing, always delivering victories that seemed impossible. They trusted him completely. His brother Mago commanded part of the infantry. Hannibal led the Numidian cavalry, light horsemen who could ride circles around Roman cavalry, harassing, retreating, refusing to commit until the decisive moment. Hasdrubal commanded the heavy cavalry, Gallic and Spanish horsemen who could charge and break enemy formations. Hannibal positioned his army carefully, exploiting every advantage the terrain offered. The Aufidus River ran along one flank, protecting it from encirclement. Hills provided observation points. The field itself was open, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. Hannibal placed his heavy infantry Africans equipped with captured Roman armor and weapons on the flanks. In the center, he placed his Gauls and Spanish, good fighters, but less disciplined than the Africans. This wasn't a mistake. This was the key to his entire plan. Varro saw Hannibal's formation and made his decision. The Roman army would attack in a massive column, deep ranks that would smash through Hannibal's center by sheer weight. The consular legions formed up, 80,000 infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks. The formation was deeper than normal, sacrificing width for depth, maximizing pressure on Hannibal's center. Varro believed the center would collapse under Roman weight, breaking Hannibal's army in half. Once the center broke, the Roman cavalry would chase down fleeing troops, and the infantry would mop up resistance. It was straightforward, relying on Roman superiority in numbers, armor, and discipline. It should have worked. Against any other commander, it might have. Against Hannibal, it was suicide. The battle began with cavalry clashes on the flanks. On the Roman right, near the river, Roman cavalry engaged Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry. The fighting was brutal, dismounted combat in many places as horses collided and riders hacked at each other with swords. Hasdrubal's cavalry had the advantage. They were better trained, more experienced, and outnumbered the Romans. Within minutes, the Roman cavalry broke, fleeing the field or dying where they stood. Hasdrubal didn't pursue. He regrouped his cavalry and led them behind the Roman infantry line, riding all the way across the battlefield to support Hannibal's Numidians on the opposite flank. On the Roman left, the larger Roman cavalry force engaged Hannibal's Numidians. The Numidians fought in their traditional style, skirmishing, throwing javelins, refusing to commit to a full charge. They harassed the Roman cavalry, drawing them forward, keeping them occupied. When Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry arrived, crashing into the Roman cavalry's rear, the Roman horsemen disintegrated. Some fled, most died. Within less than an hour, both Roman cavalry wings were destroyed. Hannibal now controlled the entire battlefield. The Roman infantry, 80,000 men locked in combat with Hannibal's center, had no idea they just lost the battle. The Roman infantry advanced into Hannibal's center, pushing forward in massive ranks, shields locked, stabbing with short swords, grinding through resistance. The Gauls and Spanish in Hannibal's center fought hard but gave ground. Slowly, step by step, they were pushed back. The Roman formation pressed forward, believing they were winning. The center of Hannibal's line bent backward, forming a crescent shape with the Romans pushing into the bulge. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted. He depositioned his weakest troops in the center deliberately, knowing they'd give ground under Roman pressure. The bending line absorbed the Roman advance, channeling 80,000 men into a shrinking space. The Romans packed tighter, ranks compressing, losing the ability to maneuver. Soldiers in the front fought and died. Soldiers in the back pressed forward, unable to see what was happening, just pushing forward because that's what they were ordered to do. The Roman commanders, somewhere in the middle of that mass, had no visibility, no way to assess the battle, no ability to adjust tactics. They were committed. All 80,000 men were locked into a single, grinding push forward, and Hannibal's flanks hadn't moved yet. On both sides of the crumbling Roman formation, Hannibal's African heavy infantry stood in perfect order. These were veterans, men who'd fought at Trebia and Trasimene, disciplined and experienced. They wore captured Roman armor, carried Roman shields, fought with Roman tactics. They'd been waiting, watching the Roman center push forward, watching the Roman formation compress into a tighter and tighter mass. Now, on Hannibal's signal, they attacked. Both flanks turned inward, crashing into the sides of the Roman formation. The Romans, packed shoulder to shoulder, couldn't turn to face the new threat. Men on the edges tried to pivot, tried to form a defensive line, but there was no space. The soldiers behind them kept pushing forward, unaware that the flanks were collapsing. The African infantry cut into the Roman formation like blades, killing men who couldn't defend themselves, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything but die. The Roman advance stopped. The legions tried to reorganize, but organization requires space and time, and they had neither. They were trapped in a packed mass, surrounded on three sides, unable to maneuver. Then Hasdrubal's cavalry completed the encirclement. Having destroyed both Roman cavalry wings, he led his horsemen to the rear of the Roman infantry formation and charged. The Romans had no rear guard, no reserves positioned to stop a cavalry attack from behind. The cavalry crashed into the back ranks, killing men who didn't even know they were under attack. The encirclement was complete. 86,000 Romans were surrounded by 50,000 Carthaginians. The Roman numerical advantage was irrelevant. Numbers don't matter when you can't bring them to bear. The Romans were packed so tightly that most couldn't fight. The men on the outer edges, facing Carthaginian infantry and cavalry, fought and died. The men in the interior suffocated, crushed by the press of bodies, trampled as the formation collapsed. Hannibal's forces tightened the noose, compressing the pocket, killing methodically. This wasn't a battle anymore, it was a slaughter. The Romans fought with desperate courage. They had no choice. Surrender wasn't an option. Hannibal's forces were too busy killing to take prisoners. Men fought until they dropped from exhaustion or wounds. They fought without hope, knowing they were going to die, fighting anyway, because that's what Roman soldiers did. Consul Paulus, who'd opposed giving battle that day, fought on the front lines and died there, sword in hand, surrounded by dead legionaries. Varro, whose decision to attack had doomed the army, managed to escape with a small group of cavalry, fleeing the field before the encirclement closed completely. Thousands of Romans tried to break out, forming wedge formations and charging Hannibal's lines. Some succeeded, cutting through Carthaginian troops and escaping into the countryside. Most failed, dying in the attempt. The killing continued for hours. As the afternoon sun beat down, the pocket shrank, compressed tighter, until there was nowhere left to run. By evening, 70,000 Romans were dead or dying. Another 10,000 were captured. Hannibal's losses were maybe 6,000, most of them Gauls who'd borne the brunt of the initial Roman assault. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Bodies piled waist-high in places, blood pooled in the dirt. Wounded men cried for help that wouldn't come. Carthaginian soldiers walked among the dead, finishing off the wounded, stripping bodies of armor and weapons. Some Romans, pinned under piles of corpses, suffocated slowly, too injured to dig themselves out. Others, driven mad by the carnage, killed themselves rather than face capture. The scale of death was incomprehensible. Rome had lost an entire generation of military leadership. Both consuls, 48 military tribunes, 80 senators who'd served with the army, all dead or captured. Entire families were wiped out. Cities across Italy lost their entire male populations. The catastrophe was total. News of Cannae reached Rome days later. Panic gripped the city. Hannibal had destroyed the largest army Rome could field. There were no more armies. The city itself was defenseless. Rumors spread that Hannibal was marching on Rome, that the war was over, that Rome should sue for peace before the Carthaginians arrived. But Rome didn't surrender. The Senate, reduced by the deaths at Cannae, met and made a decision that defined Roman civilization. They would not negotiate. They would not surrender. They would raise new armies, continue the war, and defeat Hannibal regardless of cost. The Senate prohibited public mourning, banned women from weeping in the streets, because displays of grief would hurt morale. They freed slaves to serve in new legions, armed them, and sent them to defend the city. They borrowed money, melted down temple treasures to mint coins, and called up every man capable of holding a weapon. Rome absorbed a blow that would have destroyed any other state and kept fighting. Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, allegedly told him after Cannae, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." He urged Hannibal to march immediately on Rome, arguing that the city could be taken while it was defenseless. Hannibal refused. He didn't have siege equipment. He couldn't storm Rome's walls with the forces he had. More importantly, he didn't need to. His strategy was to break Rome's alliance system, to make Italian cities believe Rome couldn't protect them, forcing them to defect to Carthage. Cannae was supposed to be the psychological blow that achieved this, and it worked partially. Several major cities defected. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, joined Hannibal. Syracuse in Sicily switched sides. Rome's alliance network cracked, but it didn't shatter. Most cities stayed loyal, either from fear of Roman retribution or belief that Rome would eventually win. Hannibal spent the next decade in Italy, winning battles, taking cities, trying to finish what Cannae started. But he never got reinforcements from Carthage. He never got siege equipment. He never had the resources to deliver the final blow. Rome slowly rebuilt, raised new armies, avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal, and attacked Carthaginian holdings in Spain and Africa. Eventually, they invaded Africa, threatening Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to return home to defend the city. At Zama in 202 BC, a Roman army under Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal, ending the war. Rome had survived. Cannae became a synonym for military disaster, a cautionary tale studied by every commander for the next 2,000 years. The double envelopment Hannibal executed, surrounding an enemy force from all sides, became the gold standard of tactical perfection. Generals from Napoleon to Patton studied Cannae, trying to replicate Hannibal's success. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy in World War I, was essentially an attempt to achieve Cannae on a continental scale, sweeping through Belgium to encircle the French army. It failed, but the obsession with replicating Hannibal's victory shaped military thinking for centuries. Cannae demonstrated that numerical superiority means nothing if it can't be applied effectively. The Romans had more troops, better equipment, and fought on familiar terrain. They lost because Hannibal manipulated the battlefield, controlled the tempo, and forced the Romans to fight on his terms. Superior tactics defeated superior numbers. That lesson echoed through history. Let's break down exactly how Hannibal won. First, geography. The battlefield at Cannae was carefully chosen. The river protected one flank, limiting Roman options. The open ground favored cavalry, and Hannibal's cavalry was superior. By positioning his army where the terrain advantage multiplied his strengths and minimized his weaknesses, Hannibal tilted the battle before it started. Second, formation. Hannibal's crescent formation wasn't weakness, it was bait. The Gauls and Spanish in the center gave ground deliberately, drawing the Romans deeper, compressing their formation. The African infantry on the flanks held firm, waiting for the moment to strike. When the Romans committed fully to the center, the flanks attacked, and the encirclement began. Third, cavalry dominance. Hannibal's cavalry destroyed the Roman horsemen quickly, then repositioned to complete the encirclement. Roman cavalry was adequate in most situations, but completely outclassed here. The speed with which Hasdrubal's cavalry won on one flank, rode across the battlefield, and crushed the other flank was operationally brilliant. Fourth, psychological manipulation. Varro thought he was winning when the Roman infantry pushed forward. He saw Hannibal's center bending and believed the enemy was breaking. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. Hannibal let the Romans think they were winning until they were too committed to retreat. Fifth, discipline. Hannibal's multinational army maintained cohesion under pressure, executed complex maneuvers during combat, and followed orders precisely. That level of discipline requires years of training and absolute trust in command. Hannibal had built that army over a decade of campaigning. They believed in him, and that belief translated into tactical execution. The Roman mistakes were equally instructive. Varro underestimated his opponent, believing Roman superiority in numbers guaranteed victory. He ignored intelligence reports about Hannibal's tactical genius. He attacked without adequately scouting the battlefield or considering how terrain favored cavalry operations. Once committed, he had no reserve, no flexibility, no ability to respond to changing circumstances. The Roman formation, designed to maximize forward pressure, became a death trap once surrounded. 80,000 men packed into a shrinking space couldn't fight effectively. The soldiers on the edges fought impossible odds. The soldiers in the interior couldn't even reach the enemy. Panic spread. Men trampled each other trying to escape. The formation collapsed into chaos, and chaos is where armies die. Roman discipline, their greatest strength, became a liability. Legionaries trained to hold formation and push forward kept pushing forward, even when pushing forward meant walking into encirclement. By the time they realized the situation, escape was impossible. The aftermath of Cannae reshaped Roman military doctrine. Future Roman commanders avoided large pitched battles against Hannibal, adopting Fabian tactics, harassment, skirmishing, scorched earth, anything except direct engagement. They learned to respect enemy cavalry, to scout battlefields thoroughly, to maintain reserves that could respond to unexpected threats. They learned that numerical superiority wasn't enough without tactical flexibility. These lessons made Rome's military more adaptive, more cautious, and ultimately more effective. The legions that eventually defeated Hannibal at Zama were better trained, better commanded, and more tactically sophisticated than the army that died at Cannae. Rome learned from catastrophe and emerged stronger. Hannibal's victory at Cannae was the pinnacle of his career and also the beginning of his slow defeat. He demonstrated tactical genius, but tactical genius without strategic resources couldn't win the war. Carthage didn't send reinforcements. They didn't capitalize on Rome's weakness. Hannibal spent years in Italy, undefeated on the battlefield, but unable to force Rome to surrender. He became a wasting asset, his army slowly eroded by skirmishes, disease, and defections. When he finally returned to Africa to defend Carthage, he no longer had the veterans who'd fought at Cannae. His army at Zama was hastily assembled, poorly trained, and facing a Roman general who'd studied Hannibal's tactics and knew how to counter them. Scipio used Hannibal's own methods against him, defeating him in the one battle that mattered. Hannibal survived, fled into exile, and eventually committed suicide rather than be captured by Rome. His life ended far from Carthage, alone, betrayed by the state he tried to save. History remembers him as one of the greatest generals who ever lived and one of the great tragic figures of antiquity. Rome's decision to continue fighting after Cannae was civilization-defining. Any other state would have sued for peace. Rome chose total war. They mobilized every resource, raised armies from slaves, borrowed money they couldn't repay, and committed to destroying Carthage regardless of cost. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept defeat, became Rome's defining characteristic. It made them terrifying enemies. You could beat Roman armies, but you couldn't make Rome quit. They'd keep coming, raising new legions, trying new tactics, absorbing losses that would cripple other nations until they won. Carthage learned this the hard way. Hannibal won every battle that mattered except the last one, and the last one was the only one that counted. The Battle of Cannae teaches us that perfect tactical execution can overcome massive numerical disadvantages, but it also teaches that tactics alone don't win wars. Hannibal won the battle and lost the war. Rome lost the battle and won the war. Strategy, resources, political will, and long-term thinking matter more than any single engagement. Cannae was the greatest tactical victory in history and ultimately meaningless because Hannibal couldn't translate battlefield success into strategic victory. Rome understood this. They absorbed catastrophic losses, adapted their strategy, and ground Carthage down over decades. The Second Punic War lasted 17 years. Cannae happened in year 3. The next 14 years were slow Roman recovery and Carthaginian decline. By the time Rome invaded Africa, the outcome was inevitable. Hannibal had won too perfectly at Cannae. He'd killed so many Romans so efficiently that there was no one left to negotiate peace. Rome had to keep fighting because surrender would mean national extinction. Paradoxically, the completeness of Hannibal's victory ensured he couldn't achieve the political settlement he needed. The tactical details of Cannae are worth examining because they're studied in every military academy on Earth. The double-envelopment, where you surround the enemy from all sides, is the theoretical perfect battle. Most engagements are decided when one side's flank collapses, causing panic that spreads through the army. Cannae went beyond that. Hannibal collapsed both flanks simultaneously, attacked the rear, and compressed the entire enemy army into a killing zone. The Romans couldn't retreat, couldn't maneuver, couldn't even fight effectively. They were trapped, immobile, waiting to die. Achieving this requires perfect coordination between infantry and cavalry, precise timing, and an enemy willing to cooperate by committing fully to a frontal assault. Hannibal created the conditions that made the Romans commit, then exploited that commitment ruthlessly. Replicating this in other contexts is almost impossible because it requires enemy cooperation. If the Romans had maintained reserves, kept their formation less deep, or retreated when the envelopment began, they could have escaped. Varro's decision to form an unusually deep formation, sacrificing width for frontal pressure, played directly into Hannibal's plan. If the Roman formation had been wider, the African infantry couldn't have enveloped the flanks as easily. Every decision Varro made worsened Rome's position. Hannibal manipulated him into those decisions through positioning, formation, and psychological pressure. Modern military analysts debate whether Cannae is replicable with contemporary weapons and tactics. Firepower, mobility, and communications have changed warfare fundamentally. Encircling an enemy force equipped with machine guns, artillery, and air support is nearly impossible. But the underlying principles remain relevant. Force concentration, maneuver warfare, exploiting enemy mistakes, these concepts still apply. The Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, where German forces encircled and destroyed a Russian army, is often compared to Cannae. The Falaise Pocket in 1944, where Allied forces surrounded German troops retreating from Normandy, echoes the same principles. Modern commanders still study Cannae because the concepts translate even when technology doesn't. Hannibal's genius lay in understanding human psychology as much as military tactics. He knew Roman commanders were aggressive, confident in Roman superiority, eager to avenge previous defeats. He exploited that aggression, giving them the battle they wanted on terms that favored him. He manipulated their perceptions, making them think they were winning until it was too late to adjust. He understood that armies are made of people, that morale and psychology determine outcomes as much as weapons and numbers. When the Roman formation collapsed, it wasn't because they ran out of ammunition or lost key terrain. It collapsed because the soldiers panicked, because they realized they were trapped, because hope died and fear took over. Hannibal engineered that psychological collapse as deliberately as he engineered the tactical encirclement. The two were inseparable. The tactics created the psychological conditions for collapse, and the collapse made the tactics effective. Cannae's legacy extends beyond military history into culture and language. Another Cannae became shorthand for total disaster. Politicians invoked Cannae to describe political defeats. Businesses used Cannae as a metaphor for competitive destruction. The battle entered collective consciousness as the archetype of perfect defeat. That cultural resonance speaks to how fundamentally Cannae shocked the ancient world. Rome wasn't supposed to lose like that. Rome was supposed to be invincible, disciplined, unstoppable. Cannae shattered that myth, revealed Rome's vulnerabilities, and forced them to rebuild their identity. The Rome that emerged from the Second Punic War was different, harder, more ruthless. They learned that survival required total commitment, that enemies who threatened Rome's existence had to be destroyed completely. Carthage learned this at the end of the Third Punic War, when Rome literally erased the city, tearing down every building, selling the population into slavery, and allegedly sowing the fields with salt so nothing would grow there again. That vindictive destruction was Rome's answer to Cannae, delayed by 50 years but absolute. You don't humiliate Rome and survive. Hannibal won the battle. Rome won the grudge match. The human cost of Cannae is difficult to comprehend. 50,000 men died in an afternoon. Families across Italy lost sons, fathers, brothers. Entire communities were depopulated. The psychological trauma rippled through Roman society for generations. Veterans who escaped Cannae were stigmatized, considered unlucky or cowardly for having survived when so many died. Rome punished them by assigning them to the worst postings, refusing to let them retire, using them as expendable troops in future campaigns. Survival wasn't reward, it was prolonged punishment. That cruelty reflected Rome's collective trauma. They needed someone to blame, and the survivors were convenient scapegoats. The consuls were dead, Hannibal was unreachable, so the men who escaped bore the guilt. Hannibal's multi-ethnic army presented unique challenges. Gauls, Spanish, Africans, and others fought together but didn't share language, culture, or religion. Holding that coalition together required constant management, balancing competing interests, distributing plunder fairly, and demonstrating success that justified continued loyalty. Hannibal managed this through personal charisma, tactical brilliance, and consistent victories. His troops followed him because he delivered results and treated them fairly. After Cannae, as the war dragged on and victories became rarer, maintaining cohesion became harder. Troops deserted, mercenaries switched sides, and the army slowly disintegrated. By the time Hannibal returned to Africa, most of his veterans were gone. The multi-ethnic coalition that worked so well at Cannae couldn't sustain itself indefinitely without continued success. That structural weakness doomed Hannibal's strategy. He needed short, decisive victories that forced political settlements. He couldn't fight a long war of attrition because his army was held together by success, not institutional loyalty. Rome's legions were different. They fought for Rome, for the Senate and the people, for concepts that transcended individual battles. You could destroy Roman armies, but Roman soldiers kept coming because they believed in something larger than themselves. Hannibal's troops believed in Hannibal. When his fortune changed, their loyalty wavered. The debate over Hannibal's criticism that Hannibal didn't know how to use victory misses the strategic reality. Marching on Rome immediately after Cannae wouldn't have ended the war. Rome's walls were strong, the city was massive, and Hannibal lacked siege equipment. He might have besieged Rome, but sieges take time, consume resources, and offer opportunities for relieving forces to attack the besiegers. More likely, Rome would have held out, negotiated for time, and eventually forced Hannibal to withdraw. Marching on Rome would have been dramatic but strategically pointless. Hannibal's strategy, breaking Rome's alliances, isolating them politically, forcing a negotiated settlement, was sounder. The problem wasn't the strategy. The problem was Carthage didn't support it. They didn't send reinforcements, supplies, or money. Hannibal was essentially abandoned, left to win the war with resources he'd brought from Spain years earlier. No general, regardless of genius, can win under those conditions. Cannae was perfect tactical execution within a flawed strategic framework. Hannibal did everything right on the battlefield and still lost the war because battlefield success doesn't matter without political and logistical support. The lessons of Cannae remain relevant. Tactics matter. Terrain matters, maneuver matters, psychology matters, but none of it matters if your strategy is unsound or your resources are inadequate. Hannibal teaches us the limits of tactical genius. Rome teaches us the power of strategic persistence. Cannae was the most perfect battle ever fought, and ultimately a footnote in Rome's rise to dominance. That paradox makes the battle endlessly fascinating. We study Cannae to understand how to win battles and to understand why winning battles isn't enough. History remembers Hannibal as a brilliant general who lost the war, and Rome as a resilient state that absorbed catastrophic defeats and emerged stronger. Both lessons matter: tactical excellence and strategic resilience. Cannae offers both in one blood-soaked afternoon on the plains of southern Italy, where 80,000 men learned that numerical superiority means nothing against perfect execution, and where Rome learned that survival requires refusing to accept defeat, even when defeat seems inevitable.